The Soviet Union spent decades building machines meant to make the sky, the ocean, and orbit itself obsolete. Not explore them. Replace them entirely. A rocket the size of a skyscraper was built to reach the moon, and it never once flew successfully. A tank was engineered to survive a nuclear war that no war ever required. A vessel the length of a football field was designed to fly, but never quite leave the water beneath it. And in 1987, one machine finally worked. It reached space. It was a weapon. Within minutes, it fell back down into the ocean. At the Central Air Force Museum outside Moscow sits a twin-hulled aircraft that looks like two fuselages fused together, with stubby wings and no obvious way to land on water. That's because it never got that ability. It was called the VVA-14, designed by the eccentric Soviet-Italian engineer Robert Bartini and first flown in 1972, and its entire purpose depended on a system that was never finished. The Soviets were terrified of American Polaris submarines that could surface almost anywhere in the ocean, launch nuclear missiles at Soviet cities, and disappear again long before a runway-based aircraft could even scramble in response. So Bartini proposed something stranger than a conventional plane. An aircraft that could take off like a jet, then hover directly over open water using inflatable lift pontoons, hunting submarines from a position no fixed airbase could ever offer, and one that couldn't be wiped out in a first strike because it wouldn't need a base to operate from at all. The airframe got built, and it genuinely flew, reaching altitudes reported at over 8,000 meters during flight testing. The pontoons never did. Engineers fitted a fixed, non-functional undercarriage instead, essentially placeholder legs bolted onto a machine that was supposed to float on inflated skirts. It could still fly through the air. It just could never do the one job it had been designed for in the first place. When Bartini died in 1974, the program lost its champion and quietly died with him. The single surviving prototype sat outside for years afterward, missing its outer wing sections entirely, slowly corroding in the open before anyone bothered to move what remained of it indoors. A machine built to conquer the ocean couldn't even keep its own wings attached in a museum parking lot. If one strange machine couldn't master water, the next one was built to do nothing else. Skim it, at extreme speed, using a loophole in the laws of aerodynamics itself. American analysts studying satellite photographs in the 1960s found something they couldn't classify. A vessel with the wings of a jet fighter and the hull of a warship, moving across the Caspian Sea faster than anything with a hull had any right to move, and flying too low to the surface to register as a normal aircraft. They nicknamed it the Caspian Sea Monster. It was the ancestor of a program that eventually produced the Lun-class ekranoplan, commissioned in 1987, a 240-ton vessel built at a shipyard in Nizhny Novgorod, riding a cushion of compressed air just a few meters above the waves at speeds over 500 kilometers per hour, armed with anti-ship cruise missiles mounted along its spine. The idea, on paper, was genuinely brilliant. Too low for most radar systems to reliably detect. Too fast for any surface ship to intercept in time. Not quite a plane, not quite a boat, and therefore effectively invisible to the categories both militaries used when planning their defenses. It was meant to become an entire fleet of missile carriers that no early warning system could track quickly enough to matter. Only one Lun-class vessel was ever completed for full operational service in the end. A second vessel, intended as a flying hospital ship for evacuating wounded troops, was never finished. The economics collapsed before the concept could scale into a real fleet, and improving satellite imaging technology made impossible to detect a far shorter-lived advantage than Soviet planners had originally counted on. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, the program collapsed along with it. The one finished vessel was retired to a naval pier in Kaspiysk, Dagestan, where it has now sat for roughly 3 decades. Various proposals to turn it into a museum piece have surfaced over the years, though its condition and final fate remain unresolved as of recent reporting. A vehicle engineered specifically to be undetectable spent 30 years rusting in plain sight, visible to absolutely anyone who cared to look at it. If the ocean skimmers were too strange to hide, the next machine had to survive a war no one was supposed to see coming, fought entirely on land, on 4 tracks instead of the usual 2. At the Kubinka Tank Museum sits a vehicle that looks less like a tank and more like a flattened metal saucer sitting on rails. It's called Object 279, weighing around 60 tons and armed with a powerful main gun, and its 4 independent track units weren't a styling choice or an engineering flourish. They were the entire point of the design. By the late 1950s, Soviet military planners genuinely expected that any major war with NATO would open with nuclear strikes on both sides, followed almost immediately by tank divisions rolling through the irradiated aftermath, cratered ground, radioactive debris fields, flooded craters, and collapsed terrain that no conventional single-track vehicle could reliably cross without becoming stuck or simply destroyed. Object 279 was engineered specifically for that exact scenario, with an ellipsoid hull shape designed to help deflect nuclear blast waves, and 4 separate track units meant to distribute the tank's enormous weight across ruined ground that would strand anything more conventional. It worked, technically. It just wasn't remotely practical. 4 independent track systems made the vehicle absurdly complex to manufacture, maintain, and repair anywhere near a real battlefield, and Soviet military doctrine gradually shifted away from expecting tank crews to physically drive across freshly irradiated ground at all. Only a small handful of prototypes were ever built before the entire project was quietly canceled around 1960, with a single example preserved rather than scrapped for parts. It was engineered to survive the end of the world, a war that Soviet planners were certain was coming within a decade. The only war it ever actually fought was against its own irrelevance. If the USSR built a tank for a nuclear war on Earth that never arrived, it also built a rocket for a race off Earth that it kept losing, over and over again, on the launch pad itself. The N-1 was the most powerful rocket the Soviet Union ever attempted to build, standing over 100 meters tall, and it never completed a single fully successful flight. It was meant to put a Soviet cosmonaut on the moon before the Americans got there first, but Soviet industry couldn't reliably manufacture the kind of massive single rocket engines that powered the American Saturn V. So Soviet engineers clustered 30 smaller engines together on the first stage instead, a workaround that multiplied the number of components that could go catastrophically wrong at any given second of flight. Between 1969 and 1972, all 4 test launches ended in failure, one after another. One of them produced an explosion reported by some accounts to rank among the largest non-nuclear blasts ever recorded, though exact figures remain genuinely disputed across different historical sources. By the time the program was finally canceled in 1974, the Americans had already landed 6 separate crews safely on the moon. The Soviet failures were kept secret from the Soviet public itself for years afterward. Then came one final, almost absurd twist decades later. Some of the leftover NK-15 engines built for that failed moon rocket were eventually sold to the United States and actually used to help power American commercial rocket launches. The engines built to beat America to the moon ended up flying on American rockets instead, decades after the program that built them was forgotten. The moon rocket failed loudly, on the ground, in eventual full public view. The next machine flew exactly once, succeeded completely, and was then left to quietly die inside a warehouse. Buran looked almost identical to NASA's space shuttle, and that resemblance wasn't accidental in the slightest. It was built partly out of fear that the American shuttle could double as a weapons platform capable of striking targets from orbit, and partly out of the belief that whatever the future of spaceflight ultimately looked like, the USSR needed its own version of it too. But Buran did something NASA's shuttle never managed, not once in its entire operational history. In November 1988, it flew its entire orbital mission, launch, orbit, re-entry, and landing, completely unmanned, guided from beginning to end by fully automated systems, even correcting for a strong crosswind during its final approach without any human input at all. No American shuttle ever attempted a fully automatic landing without a crew aboard. For one single flight, the Soviet program had actually leapfrogged its American rival. Then the money simply ran out. The Soviet Union itself was collapsing around the program, and there was nothing left to fund a second orbital flight. A sister orbiter sat permanently unfinished on the assembly floor. The one Buran that had actually flown was placed into storage at Baikonur, waiting for a future that was no longer being built by anyone. In 2002, the roof of the hangar housing it collapsed without warning, killing several workers inside and destroying the only Buran orbiter that had ever reached space, along with a full-scale mock-up of its Energia booster rocket stored beside it in the very same building. The one Soviet shuttle that had proven the technology actually worked wasn't destroyed by war or budget cuts or shifting politics. It was destroyed by its own roof. Buran was the program the world was eventually allowed to see. The next one was built entirely in secret, to fight a war above the sky that most people never even knew was being planned somewhere below them. Long before Buran, back in the 1960s, Soviet engineers were already developing something, Stranger, a two-part system in which a hypersonic carrier aircraft would launch a small orbital space plane, one capable of reconnaissance missions or, potentially, intercepting enemy satellites already in orbit. It was a direct answer to American military spaceplane concepts of that era, including the canceled X-20 Dinosaur, and it actually predated much of the later public shuttle debate entirely. The full orbital vehicle was never built. What survives today is a small, stub-winged test aircraft nicknamed the Flying Boot, officially the MiG-105, which flew a handful of atmospheric drop tests and runway landings through the 1970s before funding and institutional priorities shifted decisively toward Buran instead. A machine designed specifically to fight wars in orbit, built to shoot down enemy satellites from above, never actually left the atmosphere itself. One secret program never reached space at all. The final one on this list did, and then, whether by accident or something stranger, came straight back down again. In May 1987, the Soviet Union launched something called Polyus, sometimes referred to by the designation Skif-DM, an 80-ton spacecraft riding the very first flight of the Energia rocket, the same booster family that would go on to carry Buran into orbit a year later. Its exact intended purpose remains officially disputed to this day. Some accounts describe it as a test of space-based weapon systems, developed as a direct response to the American Strategic Defense Initiative, popularly nicknamed Star Wars. Officially, at the time, it was described publicly in far more modest scientific terms involving ecological and environmental monitoring. Some accounts claim that officials, wary of the program being seen by visiting Soviet leadership as an overt weapon just days before launch, made last-minute changes to its guidance configuration, though this remains disputed rather than confirmed. The launch itself worked exactly as intended. Separation from the booster happened precisely as planned. For a brief window of time, the Soviet Union genuinely had an operational weapons platform sitting in orbit above the planet, something that had, until that exact moment, existed only inside strategic planning documents and worst-case Western intelligence assessments. Then a guidance fault caused the spacecraft to complete an UN-planned full rotation. Its engines fired automatically to correct that orientation, but because of the rotation that had already occurred, the correction burn pushed it in exactly the wrong direction. Instead of stabilizing into a stable orbit above Earth, it fell back through the atmosphere and came down somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, never to be recovered or seen again. For a few minutes, the strangest machine on this entire list wasn't a failure at all. It was proof that the ambition behind it had been real, technically achievable, and already fully in motion. Then it sank. None of these machines were really about tanks, rockets, or aircraft. In the end, no matter how strange each one looked sitting alone in a museum or a naval yard, they were physical proof of futures the Soviet Union genuinely believed were coming. A war fought across nuclear-scarred ground, an ocean patrolled by machines no radar system could ever fully catch, a moon landing that would happen first, a battle for control of orbit fought in total secrecy from the rest of the watching world. Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, the wreckage of the only Soviet orbital weapon ever launched has been resting quietly on the seafloor since 1987, closer to actually functioning for those few brief minutes than any tank, rocket, or hybrid aircraft that came before it on this list. The future they were built for never arrived. For a few minutes in 1987, it almost did. Then it sank.